Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's community forum and panel, Homes for All, Housing Justice in Massachusetts. Tonight's speakers will touch upon topics ranging from social housing, community land trusts, tenants' rights and protections, and current pieces of legislation that are being considered here in Massachusetts. We'll end the night with a brief Q&A after a short intermission. All the registrants will receive a follow-up email, including a link to the recorded event, additional information from our speakers, and other ways to get and stay involved in pushing for equitable housing policies here in Massachusetts. Right now, we're at a pivotal moment with Donald Trump finally behind us in the rearview mirror and a Democratic president in the White House, and the post-COVID society on the horizon, though it's still not quite here yet, but it's finally in view. It's time to take a look at the hard-won lessons of the last year and fight with renewed energy to enact a better world. In the platform of the Democratic Party of Massachusetts, it plainly declares that we demand affordable, high-quality housing for all. We're eager to once again come together with our fellow Democrats and allies in the fight for housing justice, to learn from policy experts and activists about opportunities to enact positive change at the local and state level. So before we get started, I wanted to give thanks to our forum sponsors tonight, which include the Democratic committees of Acton, Barry, Bedford, Belmont, Boston's Ward 1, Braintree, Cohasset, Falmouth, Hanover, Hanson, Hull, Kingston, Lenox, Newton, Norwell, Rockland, Situate, Watertown, Weston, Weymouth, and the whole Issues Forum team at Massachusetts Call to Action. Tonight's speakers will include Huma Gupta, Minnie McMahon, Mike Leba, and House Representative at the State House, Nika Elugardo. First, I just wanted to introduce myself very briefly. My name is Laura Kiesel. I am a local housing activist. I actually myself live in affordable housing and I'm a Section 8 voucher holder. And I am part of the MassAdapt, which is a disability rights organization, their representation on the National Adapt Housing Policy Group, though I'm not representing them tonight in the position of moderator. I grew up myself in rent-controlled housing in New York City, and my brother still lives in the apartment we grew up with. It's the only way he can afford to actually still be living in Brooklyn as a low-income and disabled person. So I don't want to delay any longer, and I thought I would introduce our first speaker, Huma Gupta. Huma Gupta is a founding member of Project Right to Housing in Cambridge. Currently, she is a postdoctoral fellow at Brandeis University, where she is writing the book, The Architecture of Dispossession. She has a master's in city planning and a PhD in planning and architectural history from MIT. Professionally, she has worked as a housing policy expert for the United Nations Internal Displacement Monitoring Center and on infrastructure and urban development issues in Afghanistan and Syria. In September, she will join MIT as a full-time lecturer in the architecture department. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Laura. And thank you everyone for having me here today. I feel really privileged to be the first speaker because it gives me an opportunity to sort of set the stage and talk about social housing more broadly before the other speakers kind of go into detail with some more concrete examples. But I think the question that I'm trying to pose today is how do we reimagine social housing in the 21st century, right? I think for some people, social housing evokes maybe scary images of public housing, buildings in disrepair. But in fact, social housing can look very different and does look very different in other parts of the country, even, around Massachusetts and in other countries around the world. And that's something that, I hope in the next few minutes that we can kind of explore together. But the idea of social housing essentially is to provide a decommodified form of housing. So it's sort of a way of shifting our thinking from thinking of housing as a commodity, thinking of housing as an investment, thinking of housing as something you buy and sell like any other good, and reimagining it as something that is a public good, something that belongs to all of us, right? We can't talk about a right to housing, we can't talk about homes for all if we don't imagine housing as something that is a public good. And there are many, many different forms of social housing that we can talk about, and I'll go through a few examples, but that is kind of at its core the most important thing for us to understand, that it essentially removes housing and the land necessary for housing development out of the kind of vagaries, the bubbles and bursts of the housing market. Next slide, please. So just briefly today, I'm going to be talking about kind of the definition of social housing, why it's so vital, and a proposal for a social housing development authority, which is, something that is interesting and I think could possibly be applied in Massachusetts as well, and the opportunity that we have before us with the CARES Act. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start with just this basic kind of statement, which I hope doesn't come off as being too radical for anyone, but I don't think, in my opinion, that there is anything such as naturally occurring affordable housing, right? There's this idea somehow that, oh, well, if only we were to just build more housing, that suddenly we would be able to create more affordable housing because market values of housing would go down, right? That's a common conception. There are other ideas that, well, there's a way in which we can just kind of pull the levers of our market economy and maybe add a few subsidies here, or kind of have these piecemeal programs and kind of minute nonprofit interventions here and there to provide housing for certain levels of income. And then that is going to create enough affordable housing for a certain group of people, and the rest of us can just kind of afford to pay market rent. But I think the question that we have to ask ourselves, right, is when we say affordable housing, who is it affordable for? And what is the criteria for affordability? So in examples that I'll share from other countries, right, there are places like in Vienna, in Austria, where people are only paying about 20% of their income for housing. And I want you to think about what your respective incomes is and what your life would look like if you only spent 20% of it in housing. And I think that is a pretty radical leap for those of us who live in Massachusetts, because many of us, especially those who live in, denser and larger cities, are paying between 25 to 50% of our income in housing. So it has a huge impact on our quality of life. There are, of course, like ways in which people can secure so-called affordable housing, but it tends to be places that are, for instance, further away from their jobs, or places that are, poorly maintained, or just, run by let's say a building company that isn't as responsive to the needs of tenants. So while affordable housing might still be available, the quality of that housing, the location of that housing, and the amenities that come with it might be highly questionable. That's kind of the dilemma that's before us. Can I have the next slide, please? So let's go through a few different kinds of social housing. Again, social housing doesn't describe one particular thing. There's actually many, many different types of social housing. Next slide, please. The first, of course, is community land trusts. I'm not going to go deeply into this because Minnie McMahon, who is here from the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, is going to talk about this. But I do want to say that the Dudley Square Neighborhood Initiative was and still is one of the most innovative and successful kind of models of community land trust that's held up as an example for people across the country. And it is connected to what I'm going to later talk about, the Social Housing Development Authority, because it was a case in which 1,300 tax delinquent parcels and vacant private land known as the Dudley Triangle, which covered over 30 acres, were transferred to this trust, and now have produced 225 affordable housing units, playground, a community garden, a greenhouse, and commercial and office space, right? So this is kind of one of the models of social housing that is possible and that we've seen be successful right here in our neighborhood and in our state. Next slide, please. The next model are limited equity co-ops. There's also group equity co-ops. There's many different forms of co-ops, but I'll talk about this particular form because a limited equity co-op is essentially where you and the cooperative can have shared equity. So often a cooperative would get 75% of the equity, you have 25% of equity in that property, and any increase in value over time is shared between you and the cooperative. But it's a really kind of affordable or cheaper way of buying into a property where you have some kind of investment, but you aren't exactly going to necessarily create a lot of wealth for yourself. It's not the same sort of it's not the same sort of profit that you would get from a market rate investment, but what it guarantees is sort of long-term permanent affordability, not just for you, but for generations of tenants and owners. And there's an example like the Fence Gate Co-op in Boston, which is shown there on the slide in the top right corner. And then on the bottom left corner, I wanted to show this because it's a co-op in Zurich. It's called Enlitzberg 2. It was redeveloped in 2017, and it's based on a 1920s housing estate. And I mean, you can just see kind of the model of limited cooperative housing that is available in other countries around the world, where you have these beautiful high density buildings, but also large and contiguous shared open spaces. And it feels like a really wonderful and beautiful place to live, right? It's very different than the kinds of models of public and social housing we think of in the context of American history. Next slide, please. Yeah, and this is an example that I love because actually it's really an example that you hear a lot about in talks like this. Everyone talks about Austria because Austria is kind of held up as the dream. In Vienna, a vast majority, I would say maybe 40 to 50% of the population, I believe, lives in some form of social housing. So this is, dramatically different than what we, of course, experience here in the United States. And again, the question is, do we as a state, or do we as the federal government, and in the case of the United States, like consider housing to be public good? Is it an essential part of our infrastructure and our economy? And in Vienna, that answer is yes, right? It is considered an essential part of their infrastructure and their economy. And so the social housing that they're investing in is not something that is basically a place to, provide kind of an extension of like carceral forms of housing where you basically, put low-income people and kind of forget about them and do not allow them access to kind of democratic kind of ownership and democratic participation in the running of their public housing. It's not that kind of model. It's something where there's a lot of community input, right? There are amazing public amenities like swimming pools and gardens, access to transportation networks, communal spaces, regular and really responsive maintenance. And that's why, as you see in this headline, the question the writer is asking is why rich people in Austria want to live in these housing projects, right? It is shocking to think about that in the American context, but really these places that are being built are extremely desirable and extremely functional. And again, just to reiterate, right, in Vienna, people who are living in this are only paying 20% of their income on rent. So this is a really, really successful model that, we can talk more about later. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to give you another peek at this picture. That was the cover image because you can see the swimming pool, you can see the gardens. I mean, it is really gorgeous for a dense kind of urban setting. Next slide, please. So social housing is vital because it provides permanent affordability, it guarantees equity and diversity, it allocates resources efficiently. And on this point, what I mean by that is that we have a problem, right, in many of our cities across Massachusetts where housing is viewed as an investment, right? The building where I live in Cambridge has multiple vacant properties that are owned by people who don't live in Massachusetts, who are just holding on to them, not even needing to rent them out because they are wealthy enough to wait for years and years, maybe even decades before they're going to sell that property for a profit. And that kind of speculative real estate investment is creating or contributing to the housing scarcity in our markets. It's not simply a question, right, of building more housing. It's also, are we actually building housing for people, or are we building housing for the purpose of investment? And, investment in social housing serves people, not the purpose of investment. And that's a key difference. And it also stabilizes the housing market, right? You're not, again, leaving a vast majority of our housing stock, to the vagaries of the housing market cycle with bubbles and bursts every, decade or so. Next slide, please. So the one example I wanted to put forward is this idea of a social housing development authority that was kind of presented last year by NYU's Gallatin Center, the Urban Democracy Lab. And they were really thinking about housing, from the aftermath of 2008, which showed that investors are ready to capitalize on economic crises, right? When families lose their homes to foreclosure, small and large investors were ready to buy these properties at a steep discount. Similarly, because of COVID-19, where we are seeing massive eviction crisis and foreclosures, there are large corporate landlords and large companies who are really excited about actually going in and buying out these distressed or foreclosed properties and turning it into rental property that actually ends up increasing rents in those areas and basically take out more and more ability for tenants to have any voice, because now they're not only going up against a small landlord, but they're going up against a corporate landlord that has way more power and way more ability, in terms of their legal team to fight back when tenants raise their voice. So what these individuals at the Urban Democracy Lab were proposing is the creation of a public sector entity called the Social Housing Development Authority, across cities in the United States that can aggressively enter into the private housing market to prevent mass displacement and kind of prevent the consolidation of real estate holdings through these private equity firms. So instead of like just having these short-term band-aid solutions and eviction moratoria here, just kind of like these kind of intermediary solutions and throwing subsidies here and there, to actually say that we need a federal institution that has a durable sort of approach to the housing crisis, right? That intervenes to stop the mass transfer of property to the hands of speculators and that stops the wave of evictions. Next slide, please. So the method that they're proposing for this is you create an SHDA in your city. So this is a new government agency that has the authority to fund, has the capacity of, in terms of personnel, and has the autonomy to acquire distressed real estate assets like commercial real estate, retail, or hotel properties. Then after they purchase these assets, they're able to hold them and upgrade them. So many of them might require a lot of maintenance, some may not. And then finally, they would finance the transfer to social housing. So this could be financing it, transferring the land to a CLT, to a public housing authority, to a tenant cooperative, or to a nonprofit, depending on what is available in that particular city. But it's a way of intervening in that sort of moment of crisis that we are now seeing, with the pandemic, and we saw after 2008, and actually creating a new form of social housing that actually benefits us as a collective, as opposed to benefiting a few, select kind of corporate entities like Blackstone, et cetera. Next slide, please. And, I think thinking about the CARES Act, for instance, and, this is just something I was considering myself, that we have $131 billion that's been allocated to Massachusetts. I don't know if this number has changed, but that was last time I checked. 10 billion of this is going to public entities, including municipal governments. 49 billion of this is going to Commonwealth agencies, which include community development block grants. And I think the question again before us is, well, what do we want to prioritize? Do we want to prioritize only short-term, kind of solutions or band-aid solutions, or do we want to take this as an opportunity to really invest and take back land, which is at the end of the day the kind of ultimate source of wealth in this country, and redistribute it to larger tracts of the population. Next slide, please. And this is just, quickly a model that the folks at NYU kind of put forth for if, in the case of acquiring distressed multifamily residential buildings. So the building goes on sale, and then of course, we would hope that there would be a TOPA, like the tenant option to purchase, would be in place where the tenant would have 30 days to come up with funds. And if not, they are actually able to then, open up this property to be purchased by tenants, other nonprofits, other eligible entities. So these are the sort of like different ways in which that sort of purchase process could go forward. I don't want to go over my time, but I think we can end here and any questions.
Great, thank you. We're going to go right into our second panelist. We'll have our Q&A after the intermission. So our next panelist is Minnie McMahon. She is the Project and Operations Manager at Dudley Neighbors, Inc., the Community Land Trust at Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. She is also the coordinator of the Greater Boston Community Land Trust Network, which is growing the power of community land trusts in Greater Boston through advocacy, organizing, peer learning, and technical assistance. She has a background in community organizing, agriculture, public policy, and urban planning. So please welcome Minnie McMahon.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation to be here. I'm just going to share my screen and get going. All right. So, yes, I'm going to spend a few minutes tonight talking about community land trusts. Dudley Neighbors Incorporated is the community land trust at Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, which is a community planning and organizing organization. So we at Dudley Neighbors Incorporated were able to be the sort of technical arm and hold the land that the community organized and advocated for and fought for to get back into community hands, and we were able to transfer it to DNI to steward it for the long term. So I'll just go briefly, what are community land trusts? Community land trusts are nonprofit organizations that own and steward land for long-term community use. They're like nonprofits, they're governed by a board, but they're governed by a board that is much more gives residents and community neighbors, members, those who use the land, those who interact with the land, those who benefit from the land, much more proportional representation on the board of directors. And so CLTs, we acquire land, we never sell it. The idea is that we're removing it permanently from the private market. And then once we are holding that land, within our internal governance structures, can determine the use and the stewardship of that land, which is going to be based on local zoning, it's going to be based on community needs, and also principles of community well-being and solidarity. And just, Huma was speaking about this, but we have to emphasize over and over that as CLTs, we uphold the use value of land over the exchange value of land, right? So that's part of our DNA. We're engaging in a non-extractive relationship with land and with place, and really experimenting and trying to deepen collective governance. And CLTs are one of many community stabilization and community investment strategies that reject and fight against land speculation and dispossession. And it's important to note that kind of one precedent of community land trusts in this country is New Communities in Albany, Georgia, which was born of the civil rights movement in the late 1960s. It was a collective of Black farmers who bought land, farmed it, built housing, had plans to build schools, and develop community there, and still exists today as a pecan farm. And today there are about 260 CLTs in this country. The movement is growing elsewhere in the world as well. And of course, there are non-CLT influences and precedents that go way far earlier than new communities in Albany, Georgia. So briefly, I'm using housing here as an example to illustrate the structure of CLTs. Housing is a typical use on community land trusts. It is not the only use, and I really want that message to be clear to folks. Housing is a right, it is essential, everybody needs it, and we also need to feel free walking down the street and safe walking down the street and be able to have gainful employment and have our children be schooled and just like move freely and have a place to be. And community land trusts are part of helping make that happen. But the housing example helps kind of break down the structure of CLTs. So we as the nonprofit, we own the land and we're not going to sell it. A homeowner can buy the house on the land. So they're going to build equity, they're going to own their home, but they don't buy the land. So the monetary value, the cost of the land is gone, which helps make the home more affordable. The home is income restricted by our own covenant. So these homes are for low and moderate income people, and ideally, and in some cases, extremely low income people as well. And the homeowner will build equity that over time, and that there's an equity formula built into the lease that they sign with the community land trust, with the landowner. And then they're going to sell the home, having accrued some equity to another income eligible person. So, and that's the same for other uses, right? There are commercial uses on community land trusts. So we're going to strike a ground lease with a business or with a nonprofit farm or for-profit farm that is entering into a long-term lease situation on our land. So Dudley Neighbors Incorporated, Huma set this up very nicely. On the right here, we have the Dudley Triangle, which is this really concentrated area of land that had been largely abandoned. Of course, not entirely. There were nightly insurance fires. This is back in the 1980s. There was illegal dumping. The city had really reduced a lot of its basic public services. And the community fought back and said, we want to control this land. So you have an image here of the different housing developments over time on our community land trust. Our community land trust is larger than this, but this is the housing concentration. And we also have, farms on our land. We have community gardens that are run by resident communities. We have commercial spaces that, with sort of mission aligned folks. You got local entrepreneurs, arts nonprofits, arts accelerators, that sort of thing. Open space playground and orchard as well. And it's important to say that CLTs are a really important stabilization and investment strategy in a really sort of so-called downturn market like it was in the 1980s in this part of Boston. And in an entirely different context today, in this really hot, destructive in that way, speculative market, it's a way to preserve and protect land and housing so that people can afford it. So CLTs have a very low foreclosure rate when compared to housing that is not on community land trusts, and the 2008-2009 crisis really made that clear. And let me see what I want to say next. I think I'll keep it moving. The Greater Boston Community Land Trust Network, DSNI is the convener of. Dudley Neighbors Incorporated is a member of it. We are currently 7 community land trusts in Greater Boston, with emerging CLTs and other community groups really thinking about this strategy, trying to get involved, seeing if it's right in their communities. And I'll say here, Chinatown Community Land Trust They really are doing a real preservation strategy of historic row houses in Boston's Chinatown. Boston Neighborhood CLT is really advancing an anti-speculation, well, it's all anti-speculation, but anti-eviction, anti-foreclosure strategy. We at Dudley Neighbors, we don't actually do that sort of preservation of improvements. We do, we acquire vacant land and we do new construction on our land. And as a network, we're advocating for local and state policies. We're really trying to get in the money game with funders and with public officials and saying, you need to fund us. We need real capital because we're talking about real estate and we're talking about long-term investment and really shifting what our economy and what housing and neighborhoods look like. So we actually need real money. We work to demonstrate the different uses of CLTs, and we do a lot of like technical assistance and support for one another. I will mention that there are just lots of different strategies to acquire land. So we have to, sometimes we're putting an offer down, a market rate offer, and we have to scramble together various sources, public and private monies, to put an offer down and hopefully be the highest bidder. We sometimes use donations to buy land. You can acquire land from a land bank, which we do not have in Boston, the greater Boston area. So there are different strategies. You can have homes and land donated to you by private people. So there are different strategies of like how you're getting land and housing and other uses. But the sort of the stewardship model is what's central or shared among CLTs. I'm just going to show you a couple of slides just to give you a sense of the scope of what we're doing and the movement and the ecosystem that we're part of as community land trusts, right? There's a reason there's a panel here tonight and that we're all coming with a little bit of a different angle. We're all in relationship and communication. So housing preservation, I mentioned that. Eviction defense, I mentioned that. Farms, gardens, we've got a person down below saying support your local commercial spaces, and that's something we're really trying to move in Boston, is how do we get affordable commercial spaces and keep people who have riskier businesses or less capital and don't get loans to be able to have viable businesses in the city. We do workshops with our homeowners to really support their homeownership. And we also engage in community planning and land use. And that's a really huge part of our work as asset holders, right? I mean, we're more than that, but we're also critically asset holders. I'm gonna just wrap up with these, this is a great audience to say, let's talk about legislation and policies. The one thing we're really trying to push as a network is a tenant's opportunity to purchase Act, TOPA, which is essentially a right of first refusal. This is really important because it would give, specifically for CLTs and for other reasons that Mike and others will speak about, it gives a little bit more of a window for tenants to gather the money together to put an offer down on their home, on the home that they're living in, so that they can actually purchase it and they don't get evicted. It also would give tenants the right to transfer that right of first refusal to a qualified nonprofit. And that's where community land trust can step in with a little bit more of our expertise and infrastructure to acquire the property, keep the people housed, and work on collective governance together over time. We're also advocating the real estate transfer fee, which is, these are both enabling legislation, so cities and towns would have to opt in. And the real estate transfer fee is a way to generate revenue for projects like community land trust, for acquisition, for stewardship, and then for the work that my compatriots, or whatever the right word on this panel, are doing. I'm going to end by showing you that even if you're not in Greater Boston, you are in a place that is near-ish to a community land trust. This image is from the Center for CLT Innovation, cltweb.org. They have excellent resources. And you'll notice we've got quite a few community land trusts across the state. And I will end with that. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. Our next speaker is Mike Leba. Mike Leba is a map maker, legend, and myth writer, futurist, and community weaver of Latinx and Chicanx people. He is the co-executive director for the anti-displacement community organizing group City Life Vida Urbana, and has been part of this community since 2012. In his free time, he's worked on multiple electoral campaigns here in Boston. City Life Vida Urbana is a 48-year-old bilingual community organization whose mission is to fight for racial, social, and economic justice and gender equality by building working class power through direct action, coalition building, education, and advocacy in organizing poor and working class people of diverse race and nationalities. We promote individual empowerment, develop community leaders, and are building a movement to affect systemic change and transform society. So you have the floor now.
That's a mouthful, huh?
Yeah.
Thanks, Laura. Hey, everyone. My name is Mike Leba. Laura had all the great points. Thank you. I'm a new co-executive director of City Life Vida Urbana. We're a Boston-based community organizing group. Doing a lot of organizing around displacement in Boston. And, you know, it's kind of important to acknowledge, like, we have very long roots in movements of the late 60s, early 70s, civil rights movements, feminist movements, anti-Vietnam War movements. And so a lot of that informs our housing strategy right now. And so what I kind of wanted to share, I really loved both of the presentations that Huma and Minnie did. These are both social housing and land trusts are really important kind of North Stars for us. How do we get there? So I'm going to focus on kind of what we're doing right now with our work and with kind of coalition partners to get there from here in a different kind of way. So, you know, before kind of launching into the community organizing work that we do, it's definitely been named, but I wanted to put a little bit of meat on the bones on, forgive the expression, sorry. Around, you know, what we're facing in Boston, even pre-COVID, was a housing crisis. And then you layer on COVID-19 on top of that, and it creates even worse circumstances for a lot of Bostonian renters, specifically renters of color, and most specifically Black renters. And this housing crisis doesn't happen completely organically. It's, you know, the result of choices over decades, over hundreds of years, that gets us where we are today. So the first thing that I kind of wanted to share was this really amazing graphic. About a year ago, we released a report that looked at evictions in Boston by race. It looked at 10 years of housing court data. But one of the graphics that, and actually you can find the report online if you want to at bostonevictions.org. But one of the really amazing kind of resources that this report created was this graphic. In this graphic, it's basically a 100-year history of racial segregation, displacement, and resistance in Boston. So if you look at kind of the top half of this chart, these are all of the different policies that have produced segregation or displacement within the city of Boston, starting in the 1920s with racially restrictive covenants, redlining, housing discrimination, block busting, you know, white flight, and then later in the 70s toward reverse redlining, restricting multifamily zoning, all kinds of land speculation, and the foreclosure crisis, of course, most recently. And then on the bottom half of the chart is organized resistance against these policies. So in, you know, organizing against urban renewal in the South End and Roxbury, stopping the Interbelt Highway, these were kind of grassroots community-led resistance against segregationist policies. Rent control was in effect for about 20 years at this point. City Life, you know, kind of got its roots in the early 70s and began establishing eviction-free zones, talking about converting market housing into affordable housing, And DSNI is represented in here too around community control in the Dudley Triangle. That was such a huge and important innovation around, you know, desegregating the city. So I just kind of wanted to say, like, all of the policy things that we're saying today and all of the actions and moves that we're trying to make now, they're still, you know, it took 100 years at least. I mean, if you include, you know, several hundred years, if you expand the scope a little bit, but it took at least 100 years to get to where we are today. And so there's not going to be any single silver bullet. There's not going to be any single, you know, very clear, very easy path out of this. But so just to transition a little bit to our work, we do community organizing work specifically in private market housing in Boston. And so it's important to kind of distinguish, you know, there's really, well, there's many types of housing, but the way I'm kind of distinguishing it right now is there's a private market, which is, you know, largely unregulated aside from kind of habitability standards and kind of that kind of thing. There's also an affordable or an income restricted market or income restricted segment of the housing. Income restricted housing accounts in the city of Boston for about 20% of the total housing stock. The market housing accounts for about 80%. So we're kind of focused on that 80% as it impacts, you know, the highest number of people, of low income people that, you know, that we encounter. So I actually, I came across this finding today and it was really fascinating to me. I think this journal publication was published like today. So I just wanted to read it to you, but it really is talking and making a distinction between large landlords and small landlords. You know, as you know, over decades of market consolidation, you know, small landlords, typically people who live in the home that they rent, you know, they rent a unit in. This is the kind of arrangement that I'm in. I live in a building with my landlord lives above me. Qualitatively different than renting from a business. If you're renting from a business, that's a very different experience. So I wanted to share this, which is a finding from this report, drawing on over 4 million property tax records, business filings, and court-ordered eviction documents over 15 years in Boston. This researcher shows that large landlords file evictions at 2 to 3 times the rates of small landlords, and this disparity is not driven by the characteristics of the tenants they rent to. Not only do large landlords file more often, but also over less money owed and more often as a rent collection strategy. For small landlords, organizational informality and personal relationships with tenants make eviction a morally fraught decision, while for large landlords, formal decision-making and arm's-length relationships with tenants make eviction a routine business practice. So this is something that I just kind of wanted to point out as in Boston specifically, over the last, you know, I would say, you know, 15 years that I've kind of been observing the housing, the rental market, there's been a huge consolidation, specifically after the wake of the foreclosure crisis, into large corporate landlords. I mean, it existed way before that, but but it's been like on, you know, it's been accelerating, I would say. And I think, you know, as we kind of begin to wrestle with and reckon with the fallout from COVID-19, I anticipate this is going to be a trend. So what do we do about this? I wanted to share, City Life has an organizing strategy. We call it the three-legged stool. Oops. I will come back to that. We have a strategy called the three-legged stool. It's the sword, the shield, and the offer. Basically, this is what we do when somebody comes to us in housing crisis. The sword represents public pressure and protest. This can be, if it's somebody who's in foreclosure, can be against a bank who is choosing to evict them. In the case of a large landlord, then it will be against the large landlord. This is a really important thing to let people know that, you know, they are accountable to a community. they, you know, housing, I think it, you know, it's definitely been mentioned on this call. In addition to, you know, providing a place for someone to sleep, which is important. Like there is an exchange, a market exchange happening, but there is a social value to having affordable quality housing in our neighborhoods. And just because you only view housing as something that is in the market, that doesn't mean that we're going to let you off the hook for for the social part of it. So the sword, the shield represents legal defense, people who are facing formal eviction. We help them with pro bono attorneys, and they are, oftentimes they pursue the eviction in court, and sometimes against a jury trial, sometimes it gets appeal. There's a whole long formal court process for eviction. In Massachusetts, only a judge can evict you. And the sword and the shield really do this kind of intricate dance of so-and-so, came in, really needs a quick protest to kind of get a little bit of attention on their situation. Maybe next week they'll have court. Maybe they'll have some kind of negotiation. And so at moments like that, where the case can actually take a turn toward the positive, even though it's like a court or shield action, we'll do kind of a sword action too to kind of complement. So it is a dance. Over time, what this does is the message to landlords in this case is that, housing is a human right and we are going to push for that. Oftentimes what ends up happening is, especially in a hot market like Boston, the house gets sold. This kind of combination of direct action and legal defense forces a sale of the house. And then the question then becomes, then to who? And so the offer is kind of the last part of the strategy. And it is either winning the agreement with the landlord that is not selling that you need, or in the context of tonight's discussion, forcing a sale to a CLT, to a nonprofit CDC, to some organization that's mission is to keep it permanently affordable for the tenants, as long as they want to live there. Through this kind of like dance between the sword and the shield, we've actually been able to see land trusts acquire buildings at significantly below market cost. There is actually a dollar cost, especially in a very expensive market like Boston. If you have an occupied and organized building, there's a cost difference between buying an empty multifamily building. And we actually consider that to be part of a capital stack for acquisition for a land trust. And I think the kind of last thing that I'll say, because I know I'm running out of time, is similar to in the same way that we kind of view our organizing strategy as this multi-pronged strategy, we also see policy this way. So, I know that Minnie mentioned some really great some really great policy. We definitely are supporters of TOPA. I think that would be that's a really important intervention that we can make right now. Additionally, two other bills that I would kind of put on people's radar. We still are, for better or worse, and even if it's not legally official, we still are in a pandemic. So we have a COVID housing equity bill, which still protects some of the people that are not included in the CDC moratorium. This bill, the COVID housing equity bill H1434, if you're interested, you can go to homesforallmass.org to get more info about it. And then the last bill that I'll throw out there is the local options for tenant protections bill. It was a bill that was filed last year by Mike Connolly and Nika Elugardo. And so it's refiled again this year. In addition to kind of these revenue bills and these and this kind of social housing and creating new affordable housing, which are both vitally important, also protecting people in the current housing market is also a priority. So I think with that, I'm going to wrap up. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And that's a good segue, because now we'll be hearing from Representative Nika Elugardo next. She has over 25 years of experience in community and economic development with public, private, and nonprofit leaders, especially in BIPOC communities. Her college and graduate studies centered on urban planning, leadership studies, tax law, human rights, and corporate social responsibility, and have bolstered her professional career helping nonprofit and business leaders work together to break injustice and open doors to opportunity. Centering grassroots and Indigenous leaders as experts and guides, Nika has partnered to develop breakthrough models and collaboration in education, youth development, and violence prevention, gender justice, and anti-trafficking in Boston and internationally. Nika's work experience, training as a lawyer and policy leader, progressive values and passion position her as a bold, effective leader on Beacon Hill, where she now represents the 15th Suffolk District, which includes Metro Boston communities of Brookline, Jamaica Plain, Mission Hill, and Roslindale. As a state rep, she continues her mission to expand the power and voice of people historically marginalized, from incarcerated activists to public housing residents to immigrant and BIPOC leaders.
Oh my gosh. Thank you, Laura, for that yeoman's effort. I got to shorten that thing. I thought I did, but I gotta keep shortening that thing. When I'm getting bored by hearing it, that's not a good thing. Anyhow, I am so excited to follow such an action-packed, intellectually packed, and passionate set of presentations. The good news about that is your heart and your brains are full. The bad news about that is that I'm going to say a lot of stuff in a small amount of time also. so take your, and I'm not going to have a fancy presentation to help you follow it. So any housing fellow volunteers out there, we definitely could use some help if I say useful things capturing it, because I just say it over and over, and we need some slide decks. Anyhow, take just a second, because I think you've heard a lot, and it's worth taking a 10-second breather to just regather yourself and also recognize that you're about to get another download. I think that was around 10 seconds. I wasn't counting. You can take your own time. All right, now put on your hat, your fire hat, because the fire hose is about to come at you again. Fortunately, Huma canceled a whole bunch of what I was going to say, saved me a bunch of time, and I just packed it with new stuff. I took furious notes because I was like, oh, great, she's talking about that better than I would. So first, we need a paradigm shift, right? Before we talk about policy, it's important to ground it in something. I was asked to also talk to you about an ask. Thinking about the ask in a better way is something I've been putting a lot of work in. I have a little team that's making some videos, but those won't be out until sometime in the fall. So if you take good notes, you can make your own video or your own slide deck. But before we get to the ask, what is this vision that we have? And a lot of times legislators and even advocates, which I used to be, forget to cast the vision before diving into the action items. So thank you to our couple of our speakers. Actually, all of our speakers did that on some level. But from the legislature's perspective, housing for all means 100% of our population in the Commonwealth lives in affordable housing. And one standard for that is acceptable, but as Huma pointed out, there are better standards in other parts of the world, is they're spending 30% or less of their income on housing costs, whether that should be a mortgage or rent, okay? And housing for all being 100% is more than just kind of like an idea, because right now people are working furiously to fix the fact that there are only 1 in 5 people who need affordable housing that have it. And the way that they're fixing that is trying to drop that number to 1 in 4. And if that's our target, we're going to land somewhere between 4 and 5 out of somewhere between 3 and 4 out of 5 people that don't have housing. And so we have to flip the ways that we're talking about policy to understand what is the gap that we're leaving and recognize that we're institutionalizing the gap. So to say we're going to increase by 200%, if that still leaves 50% of the people without affordable housing. You're institutionalizing structurally that there will be at least 50% of the population that does not have affordable housing. So this is a paradigm shift that's not just in terms of like a passionate a vision, but it's also a very numerical and quantitative vision shift that we need to make in how we think about numbers and data and the kind of data that we demand. So in the Housing Committee, which I've recently been appointed to, and in the Ways and Means Committee, which I've also recently been appointed to, I'm constantly asking, either in the hearings or in follow-up meetings, you gave data on improvement when the executive agencies come and speak to us. I want to know who still isn't being served. That's the number the legislature has to work with. And when you give us a bill recommendation, can you tell us how many, for example, if there are 430,000 units that are needed to meet the demand, right? More than what we have right now in affordable housing. That's a number that was said to me when I asked this question. And you're proposing this particular bill or this particular line item in the budget. How much of that demand will it meet? And sometimes the numbers are like 16 units or 25 units, right? So we work really hard on policies to get them passed that don't even formulate a drop in the bucket. And while that's not irresponsible on the individual level, because we're all working on our little piece of it, it's irresponsible for us collectively to not have a comprehensive picture in the legislature. I know many organizations have those things on their walls. And so I've been asking folks to bring that to me. So my ask to you is get me that data. And I've already talked to the housing chair. He's excited to have a he seems excited, I should say, I don't want to speak for him, to have a data-driven approach to understanding not only increases in good things, but also decreases in reaching our target population. The thing that I don't have to talk about is, what does the paradigm shift mean about investing in a public good? And I actually dropped my note here with my cell phone. I'm hoping specifically that Huma, you will pick that up and follow up with me, because I have some more stuff to learn. Yeah, I have worked with the SNA and I have worked with Mike Leba quite a bit, but I need to learn more about what you're doing in social housing, and we need to discuss what kinds of bills we can draft to get closer there, or to at least start that conversation. So please follow up with my office on that. But yes, especially public housing, right, which we need to reimagine anyway, and I'll touch on that briefly in a bit. Especially with public housing, we need to think about all the residents as investors and co-creators. All right, so our bills need to be including investors and co-creators as residents written into the law who have enumerated rights. TOPA is one example of that. So I'll come back to that. But the paradigm shift is something that legislators need to do as well. Okay, so that was the warm up. But now I want to talk to you about, gosh, I think I have 3 minutes. All right. Yeah, I'm going to try it. I'm going to try the whole thing. All right, so I break down a legislative agenda for housing for all into a 5-star. It used to be a 3-legged stool like Mike's, but you guys have educated me on some things. So they're not in any particular order, but we need inclusionary zoning with increases in supply. So the governor's always talking about making, the zoning process easier so that people can get stuff done. But if you just do that without any equity or inclusionary zoning principles involved in that, you will expand the inequities. And that's what we do in Massachusetts. We cite aggregate data and increases without noting that we have exacerbated longstanding inequities and gaps between the rich and the poor. So we need to do that together. We need structural racism and inequity analysis-based solutions. So that includes tenant protections, it includes accessibility. So if we're looking comprehensively to solve the whole problem, that is another point in the star. Number 3, we need to, as I said, reimagine and expand public housing. And I have a bill that does that, a beginning of that, but we have to make procurement easier. We have to make land easier to get. We have to engage residents, as I said, as investors. We have to make it easier to generate capital using state land. I've had some students doing a study. There's over $1 billion in unused state land that's potentially suitable for either affordable housing development or for generating capital for affordable housing. But there are actually all kinds of state legal barriers to getting access to that, and even for housing authorities to take out a development loan on the equity on their own land. If it's state-owned land, there's like a whole very complicated and expensive process. So we're trying to get rid of that process to even create the infrastructure on which you can reimagine public housing and make it something like social housing, as has been discussed. We need to have climate rehabilitation readiness and re-envisioning also incorporated into our understanding of housing, because housing is a major culprit and housing is a major part of the solution. And finally, we need money, as has been suggested. So we need affordable housing dollars. But I like saying that one last, because a lot of people think if you have affordable housing dollars, you solve the problem. But no, throwing money at the problem without re-envisioning the infrastructure issues and the zoning issues and the tenant protections and equity protections and EJ protections and environmental justice, you're going to land, you're going to spend a bunch of money flushing down the toilet on a few pilots that work, but the next generation will inherit exacerbated problems. And so we have to look at this comprehensively. All right, your ask. Okay, your ask. So before you do your ask, number one, you need to identify your legislator, right? And so, oh, I have more time than I thought. Shoot, don't tell me that. Okay, I'm gonna pretend I didn't see that note. Your legislator is, you need to know who they are. So I put in here the legmap.org. So look for my note at 6:56 p.m. That's something that Senator Brownsberger created. The great thing about that is you can see the shape of the district, right? So you can see the shape of the Senate district and who all of the reps are. Anywhere you point on that district, it'll show you the shape of the district. So you can figure out not only where you live, but if you're part of a constituent organization, it'll help you develop an understanding and an organizing model around where your membership is, so you can activate them. But you're not just identifying who the legislator is, you also want to identify their influences. Which caucuses are they on? There's a rural caucus, there's a Gateway Cities caucus, there's a progressive caucus, there's a Black and Latino caucus. Which delegations are they in? Western Mass delegation? Are they in the Boston delegation? Are they in the Lawrence delegation? Are they from the South Shore? And so who are they influencing? And then you need to identify their choir status, I call it. So this is all before you make an ask. And does it not remind those of you who have worked on elections of getting ready to do the field, to knock on doors, right? You need to understand the legislators, just like your community organizing, whether it's for politics or for policy. All right, so the choir status means, are they somebody that's likely to support this bill if they understand it? And they just need to understand it. Are they somebody who's a swing voter for either political or personal or policy reasons? They might go either way. Or are they opposition? You need to know this before you make an ask. And if it's your representative, there is still an ask, even for opposition, because they represent you. All right. So that's identifying the legislators. Second, you want to make an ask. All right. So how you're going to make the ask, you've identified your regional connection. You're making sure that the people with regional connections are the ones talking to the legislator, because that's who especially on the House side, where our districts are so small, 40 to 45,000 people, we just care about what's going on locally, most of us, right? And so for some of us, that's a lot of suburbs and a few rural areas. So they're trying to either survive or do their suburb thing. They're not necessarily full of activists like Jamaica Plain. All right. And so you need to speak to how your bill works with those different types of populations. So the ask, all right, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to understand, you're going to make them understand why the bill is important to you. So you can't just make the ask, just like you can't knock on a door and say, vote for me or vote for my favorite candidate, and then tell them who they are and then ask them the questions about what they care about, right? That's not how you make an ask. So first you want them to understand, this is why this bill is important to me. Second, you want to ask questions. Do you have questions or concerns? You want to write those down and send them to the filer so that they can be aware of those and address them at the hearing or in other ways, all right? But you got to track that stuff. You just having it in your head is less helpful to the passage of the bill, all right? So when they articulate questions and concerns, write them down. If they like the bill, ask them to co-sponsor it and to testify. So that's 1, 2, 3. Make sure they understand. Ask if they have questions or concerns. Now you're going to start asking. Co-sponsor or testify. And number 4, if they say, I'm already co-sponsor, will you recruit others, co-sponsors and testifiers? Ask them that. Make them answer the question. Make us answer the question. Yes or no. Did you do it? Remind us, okay? Unless we ask you not to. I like to be nagged. Not everybody's like that. All right. And then number 5, ask them to pass on your conversation to the committee. So you need to know the committee it's in. I put that information there too for those who don't know how you find that out. That's actually one of the few things that's easy to find out. You can find out the committee it's in by looking up the bill, and then you can find out who are the members of the committee right on the MA legislature website. So if you have a great supporter in your legislator and they say, I've already, let the committee know, that's great. But if they say, I'm not sure, I'm still trying to get more information, I'm hearing from different sides, homeowners are saying this, business owners are saying that, I'm just not sure, then you can still say, I would like you to tell the chairpersons of the committee that you spoke to me and why I care about this bill. Because we are your representatives. And so we don't have to agree with you to pass on your feedback. And so that's a very important thing to remember, that you always make an ask of your representative. We're representing you. So if we disagree, then you say, okay, I can understand some of your questions and concerns. I'll take those back to the filer or to the advocacy group that sent me. And I would like you to report to the committee that I express these concerns to you and that you're hearing from me and people like me. All right. So that's how you do an ask. One day there will be a video on that and you'll be so psyched because you'll pass it around and then you'll make it a better video and then we'll all be in good space. All right, so how much time do I have? Text me so I can know before I run through this legislation, most of which has been mentioned. So I'm not getting the text, so I'm just gonna keep going, okay. All right, so I was asked to speak specifically to H 1378, which is the Tenant Protections Act. I'm gonna run through some of the things that it does real quick, but before I do that, let me spit out a bunch of bills, and I put a lot of the numbers there so you can look at them, okay? So there is a public housing, I'm gonna say my bills because I understand them, and then a few other ones, a lot of which have been said. Public housing expansion, right? Talked about what that does. HERO bill, okay, so that raises money for affordable housing and climate by a modest increase. Well, it's a double increase, but it's such a low fee in the deeds excise fee that's paid when you sell your house, okay? But our current fee is less than half of most of the New England states. And so doubling it doesn't even bring it to the regional norm. All right, so in that sense, it's modest as far as revenue raising goes. And half of the money goes to affordable housing and half of it goes to climate. All right, Elder Protections Act, that's a bipartisan bill. This session, I got a Republican to sign on with me to freeze property taxes for folks 70 and older. I'd love to do it younger, but couldn't get that. And also some tenant protections for elders 65 and older. We have HD 4041, which you're gonna love when it gets released. But we've gone through every single housing law, and this is what it looks like to do structural inequity work. You have to go through the structure, okay? And if it's systemic, it's pervasive. Now hang on with me, you've got your thinking hats on extra tonight, because this is a point I really want you to take away in your conversations with other legislators, okay? Are you looking at the existing law to see where racism and inequity is and deleting it? Like, that's the thing. It's the stuff we're tweeting about, the stuff that we're doing on social media is usually the results. It's not the reason, all right? The reason is this invisible geeky stuff that requires you to do what we're doing with HD 4041. We're going through every piece of housing legislation, 40B, 40T, all of them, renovating housing, public housing, 121B. I think I'm throwing out the right numbers. I got to really memorize them and get them down for you guys. I've learned a lot of housing law. And we're adding a preference for formerly incarcerated people. Because you can't just say, we want to make sure incarcerated people get housing. You have to go through the places where people are given housing, and you have to identify them as a special population. That's how that gets done. And that needs to be done in all these areas of housing law that we're looking at. It needs to be very precise, okay? So I just wanted to use that as an example. We've got some broker fee stuff. So Boston folks, raise your hands. You don't really have to. I can only see like 20 of you anyway, 16, I think, of you, 15 because of me. But Boston folks, there's some good home rule petitions filed by Councilor Lydia Edwards. So the Homes Act has eviction ceiling. That's filed by Reps. Moran and Senator Boncory. It has some other great eviction protections in there. There's a Boston linkage update to generate money, millions of dollars for Boston affordable housing. There's various real estate transfer fees that aren't home rule petitions. That goes for everyone. But wherever you live, you may have a real estate transfer fee that's been filed by your rep. So I haven't looked recently. Last year, I think about between 7 and 12 of them, if I remember correctly. And then there's usually a statewide one that gets filed as well, which is true this year. TOPA's been mentioned. So those are the bills. And then I'll close with the Tenant Protections Act. So the thing to do with the Tenant Protections Act, it's about lifting the ban on rent control. Most of the people that know about that act know that. But we are remessaging how we say that and how we explain it. Because people, for reasons I don't understand and don't need to understand, have a panic reaction to the idea of reinstituting rent control. Okay? And so you can't address a panic reaction with a logical statement. You have to tell a different story. All right, so that's just everybody organizing, you know that, but you sometimes aren't applying that. We sometimes don't apply that to legislators. They're just another group. We're just another group to organize. All right. So what we're talking about, if you just go online and you type MGL, that stands for Mass General Laws, Chapter 40P, you're going to see how ridiculous the language is that actually bans rent control. I don't have time to do that. Go look that up. It's hilarious. Like what it says in there is like so outdated. You're going to laugh when you read it. I promise. Well, you know, if you have a sense of humor. I'm just kidding. All right. So the new messaging is this isn't the rent control from the 80s. This is a flexible vehicle for towns and municipalities to choose how to regulate rents, to make sure that the market growth is moving at the right pace for everyone. They can select towns and they can select zones within the city. This was an idea I think we actually got from City Life. That's where I first heard it. And Mike and I put it in. You can have these empowerment zones. You can also have zones that are free from rent regulation within the city. So it gives towns and cities flexibility to choose what they want to do, and they can also do nothing at all. So then the voters will demand on the local level the types of legislators that they want that are going to satisfy the particular values that they have for their town and city. So it's a local option. That's what that means. They can do it or not do it. So that's really important. It also has all of these things are local options. All of these things you can decide to do as a municipality or decide not to do. Rent and eviction protections, like just cause protections, like things like you have to have a notice to quit. Some protections against exorbitant upfront fees, but that's an option. It gives the municipality the option to say, oh, you have to do a payment plan if they need it or whatever. Or you can't charge X number of months or whatever. And as I said, these anti-displacement zones. So those are some of the legislation you want to check out. But more importantly, pick your passion and make the right type of ask to the right legislator. That's where we really need to grow, because we become real smart about the content. We need to be more comprehensive in the content, and we need to be more specific in our asks.
Thank you so much for that breakdown. So we are going to take a 5-minute intermission. I want to thank my speakers again. And after the intermission, stick around. We'll have a Q&A for people, and I will be posing it to the panel.
Si esa se essa rua fosse minha, eu mandava ladrilhar com pedrinhas de diamantes, só pra ver meu amor andar pra lá. Nessa rua tem um bosque que se chama solidão. Dentro dele mora o anjo que roubou meu coração. Se eu roubei teu coração, tu roubaste meu também. Se eu roubei teu coração, é só porque te quero bem. Se essa rua fosse minha, eu mandava ladrilhar com pedrinhas de diamantes, só pra ver meu amor andar pra lá. Nessa rua tem um bosque que se chama solidão. Dentro dele mora um anjo que roubou meu coração. Se eu roubei teu coração, tu roubaste meu também. Se eu roubei teu coração, é só porque te quero bem. É só porque te quero bem.
Okay, thanks for everyone who has stuck around so far. So we will get to the questions. I also wanted to mention there should be a Google form in the chat for people who attended tonight if they're interested in looking at that and filling it out. I also wanted to give a shout out that I think State Senator Jamie Eldridge is also in attendance, as well as the governor's counselor, Paul DiPaolo. So I'm just going to be looking through some questions we have here. Let me find the first one we have tonight is regarding disability. As difficult as it is to find affordable housing across the Commonwealth, it is catastrophic for people living with disabilities that limit their housing options. I use a manual wheelchair. I'm also immunocompromised. I've been looking for a safe, affordable first floor apartment that would allow me to stay and be integrated into my community since well before the pandemic. What work is being done to assure people with disabilities have options that are both accessible and affordable in our communities? I just want to say that I have a similar struggle. I'm also on the top floor with no elevator, and I've been trying to find a first floor apartment because of my disability. And this is a big problem in the disability community. And I know it's a concern because a lot of times when we also talk about density and building up. There's like, well, are those going to be accessible units? Are we going to have elevators? Are we going to have floors that disabled people or those who are mobility impaired can actually access? So I don't know who wants to address that first. It's just to the whole panel.
I am not sure whether I'm missing something at the legislature, but I think that there's not enough being done. I think that it's one of the many problems of not having a comprehensive policy. There's no COO or CEO or executive director of the legislature that makes sure that you're filling in the gaps. It's all done in piecemeal. And so I've been asking advocates to help me create a map for the housing agency. I'm sorry, for the housing committee. So we can look at where these major gaps are and how they've been quantified and link those to the stories that we're hearing in our hearings all the time so that we can better take action. And hopefully we'll get a change in the executive branch, because it's really the job of the executive branch to track performance on targets in these areas. And so I apologize on behalf of the legislature for letting you down as a person with disabilities, and for the community of people with disabilities. Not only when we design stuff did we not design it correctly for everyone, but we don't design enough. And so it's something that I'm committed to. It's something I need help with.
I mean, I think, I think this kind of question, so there's the material part of it, which absolutely there is a lack of availability for units like that. I mean, there's a lack of units for affordable housing generally, but especially for, people who have a physical disability. But I also think, just kind of building on what Rep. Nika mentioned earlier around vision, it absolutely has to be our collective vision to push for affordable, accessible, healthy housing that meets our needs, right? And so one of the things that I think is just worth highlighting is that that this should be a part of all of our policy work and all of our all of our thinking around housing. It is ineffectual if you're not, you find the need, you identify the need, and you meet the need, and if we're not meeting the need, then we're not solving the problem. Around housing. So
Thank you. The next question is specifically for Huma. This is from someone who lives in Cambridge and has a Section 8 voucher, I believe, or is a Section 8 tenant. And she is asking what can be done to help Section 8 tenants in Cambridge find decent housing. The Section 8 housing in Cambridge is miserable. The landlords and owners are often corrupt. I have been in the same building for 27 years. For the last 5 years, I've been trying to get out of here. My landlord owns 12 Section 8 buildings in Cambridge, but they're all basically not in good shape. There are infestations and maintenance issues. So basically the question is what can be done more for Section 8 tenants in Cambridge, and I would say beyond as well.
Thank you, Laura, for sharing that question with me. So I think that, I mean, there's not one easy answer to this. I think one aspect of it is the need for more public housing or Section 8 tenant organizing, right? We have in certain parts of Cambridge, we do have in certain buildings, we have elected tenant councils. We have also the Alliance for Cambridge Tenants. But Cambridge has a really storied and incredible history of tenant organizing in the 60s and 70s and 80s. But unfortunately, in the 90s and, in the last few decades, tenant organizing has really fallen out, both in the market rate tenants and for public housing tenants. So I think the first big thing is tenant organizing, building up tenant power. And we're actually seeing this happening with the Greater Boston Tenants Union, which has, just in the past year has started, year and a half, 2 years now, has started organizing autonomous tenants unions. Some are directed towards certain corporate or like large landlords. So there's the Alpha Tenants Union, the Feinberg Tenants Union, and some are, building specific. But I think that's one part of the equation. The other part of the equation, which has to do much more with the structure of Cambridge. So many people may not realize this. I think even people living in Cambridge don't get it, but but we don't really have a full-on democracy in Cambridge, right? We do elect 9 city councilors, and among those city councilors, someone, a mayor kind of emerges. But actually, Cambridge is run by a city manager who controls the executive function and controls all of these agencies and appoints people, hires and fires people essentially. And the council doesn't even really have veto power over these appointments. And so the question of accountability for how Section 8 Section 8 tenants are being treated, their maintenance requests, go on being denied. All of this has to do with kind of deep dysfunction in the governance framework of Cambridge, and how we aren't really able to hold accountable the people who are actually appointed by the city manager and go through that office. We can only make requests, and I think that is actually a fundamental part of the dysfunction in the city. So one side of it is building tenant power, and the other side of it is actually having a fully democratically accountable system of government that doesn't consolidate all the executive power in one individual. So I'll leave it at there for now.
Yeah, I wanted to also add, I think it's similar in all the municipalities, but each housing authority that manages Section 8 for that town or city has a board that is elected. So people, even if they're not Section 8 holders or tenants in that municipality, can vote for the board members. People can run who are members of that community. And I think it's good if people who are actually tenant or voucher holders, more of them hold offices, hold positions on that board. And I think now there's I think it took a while for the governor to sign, but I think it's now signed. And now there's a mandate that at least one of those board members on the housing authority has to be a tenant. And has to be part of like one of the tenant associations, I think. So I just wanted to also add that. The next question is for Mike Leba. What do you think can be done about the enormous amounts of properties that are being bought up by big investment firms? This person's also citing other cities like Atlanta, but how it's driving up real estate prices and rents. I think this is basically a question of speculation.
That's a tough one. I mean, speculation is built into the system. It's not a byproduct. It is a core component. And so, I will say I was really captivated by Huma's suggestion of a social housing. I forget the term.
Social Housing Development Authority.
Thank you.
It's not my idea.
Right. Yeah. But that whole idea of, so this is something that in our organizing work we come up against quite frequently, where a house is being sold and then there's a very small amount of time for any organization to make a bid on the house. Because I mean, just like if you're selling a house as a homeowner, you in this market right now, you're getting multiple offers within a few days that are all above asking price. It's the same exact thing, when it's a building a multifamily building that's being bought, multiple units within several days above asking. The difficulty is that some of the organizational forms that we use to transition housing out of the market and into permanently affordable housing, they require a lot of time to raise enough capital to be able to make an offer on a building. So in the case of our organizing work where a building is being sold, a cash bidder, like a big real estate company, can come in and literally write a check and buy a house, within a really, really easily, relative to a CDC or a land trust, which has to do a huge amount of financial analysis and begin figuring out how are we going to get this capital to make this offer. So one of the things that that I know has been a topic of conversation within the Greater Boston Community Land Trust Network, and that we at City Life are thinking a lot about how do we create a fund which is basically very flexible capital for land trusts for occupied housing to be transitioned off of the market into a land trust. Basically, it wouldn't necessarily buy the property, which seems like the social housing strategy would. It would buy the housing, hold on to it, and sell it to a land trust at a later date. This would basically be a line of credit for CLTs to be able to make an offer and compete with an all-cash buyer. So part of it is, organizing people and organizing resources. And we've been doing a lot of organizing people. And I think, to Minnie's point earlier, we have to also get in the organizing resources kind of, area.
So you touched a little bit upon what the next person's question. This one's from Minnie, but it does ask, and I think you addressed this briefly when you spoke. How does a community land trust buy properties at market rate? How would a community initiate that at the level where they compete with houses in very expensive on very expensive properties and stuff like that?
Yeah, so some of the community land trusts in our network that's their main strategy, is acquiring occupied properties that are up for sale on the market. And they're doing it with a mix of sources, including, there's one particular program in Boston, the Acquisition Opportunity Program, that is, it's money to acquire units. It's it's like a very low interest rate, or maybe perhaps no interest, but the terms are favorable. So there's like public programs that are not quite adequate but helpful, plus private financing, like loans from a bank. That's a real issue because the rates are often a little bit too high for our type of organization. Or, and the terms might be a shorter term. We talk a lot about needing patient capital, basically needing better terms from private financiers. And then also whatever capital campaigns or donations, that's kind of the combo that is required. And I don't know, I might have missed the second part of the question.
Well, I mean, I think that was mostly it. It was just basically how do you get up? It was what you're competing with a housing market where people are buying houses at market rate. So how would you establish that area? The person who asked it, I think, is here in my town in Arlington, which is a dense area, but it's also a dense suburb. So I know that I've talked to some town officials about starting a community land trust here, and I've gotten pushback that, well, it's just too expensive here and it's too dense, and when there is a market, it's usually either wanting to do houses or luxury development for the little bit of building we can do. So I think that's what she was speaking to. I don't know for sure, but she was mentioning competition with houses.
I'll just add that the importance, the essential existence of organizing, right? So organized groups that have been, if an organization with infrastructure like City Life and the skills to like do these campaigns and strategies over and over with some very high and important degree of success, if they're in relationship with people in the community, can identify properties that are at risk, can work with those folks ahead of time, negotiate with the landlord, like that, it doesn't make it easy, but that is like a resource that I think probably definitely would facilitate the sale of a property to something like a community land trust. But that's something that we think about, like, well, what are our strategies to really scale up? Because unit wise, as community land trusts in the Boston area, we're, if you want to just do that quantitative measure, we're totally insignificant. But that's not how we measure our work only. But yeah, that question of scale, what are our strategies for acquisition and preservation? How do we identify properties and that are strategic or even possible for us to acquire. And the community organizing those relationships are central to that.
Great. I have a question, and we'll just do this one and one more because I know we're wrapping up in a few minutes. It's kind of a two-pronged question, but one, I think a couple people mentioned in passing inclusionary zoning. A lot of times the places that do have inclusionary zoning, the municipalities that have them, they're very small percentage. And I know that I worked in my community and other places like the Coalition for Truly Affordable Boston has been pushing for a higher inclusionary zoning, a more meaningful percentage. And I know I got a ton of pushback that it's just not financially feasible. The developers just can't handle it. Like the cost is too much. But it was like one of the few options, policy mechanisms we have here to build on, but it just seems like it's at this rate that's low, that's easy to evade, and going higher just gets buried. So I was wondering, one, what do we do about that if that is the argument that it's just not enough incentive and we have that pushback? The second thing is related to the affordable housing and inclusionary zoning. A lot of times it's set at rates that in and of itself is not that affordable. It's like 80% AMI, which is actually much higher than the area median income of Black and Latinx households. So even the affordable housing is kind of out of range for a lot of people. It's also usually too high for Section 8 voucher holders. So what can we do about that to make sure it's more reflective of the actual needs of people who need affordable housing, and that there's enough of it in these policy mechanisms that they can actually do what they're intended?
So Lydia Edwards, the city councilor in Boston, has a whole, almost like practically a dissertation on equity-based inclusionary zoning. She calls it something different than that. That's like a better phrase. But look her up on social media. I put one of her things there. She does all these little videos. I haven't watched them all, where she breaks that down. But she's been implementing some of that in her district in East Boston, where you are, I don't know if it goes so far as to determine smaller regions for AMI or you know, all of the different obvious things that there would be to do, but it definitely centers poor people and centers BIPOC people in the definitions of what inclusionary zoning means and looks like and what the requirements are of its outcomes. Just while I'm blabbing, I will address the public banking question. I dropped the bill numbers there. And so you guys know, we're working really hard with an incredible coalition. Senator Eldridge, Mike Connolly, and myself are really working the public bank idea that all these genius type people have formed a coalition from different parts of academia and grassroots organizing to have a really, really strong bill. And just so that you guys know, something that I learned in being part of this bill process is that if we have public dollars, every public dollar that we have, we can spend one public dollar. But if you capitalize that, right, by making it like depositing it into a public bank so that they can use those deposits to make loans and to do lending, they can multiply that by as high as $10. And I'm not saying it in a super smart way as it was said to me, because I literally learned it a couple days ago. And so I'm like studying what that's about. But this is what like rich corporations are benefiting from. And there's no reason why we can't benefit from these same regulations. And so this bill sets aside financing for affordable housing, but also for climate change and sustainable agriculture, for rural housing, and for, you know, it can be used for all kinds of stuff, tenant initiatives. And so, yes, learn more about public banks. We're going to be doing a lot more teaching on it over the course of the next year and a half, but it is an answer. And check out the model online in North Dakota, where 100% of their state deposits are in public banks. And they were able to really quickly respond in crisis to the financing needs in a way that other states were not. So definitely we need to get there.
Great, thank you. I think we're up for time. So I wanted to again thank all the speakers tonight. It was really educational and enlightening. And I'm hoping to join on other future forums where I'm hoping housing will continue to be at the forefront of our policy agendas. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great night.
Yeah, thanks for organizing an amazing forum.
I learned a lot. Thank you.